human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is The Stories Our Words Tell.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and as we do every show, we have a fascinating guest, an amazing guest. I'm really excited about tonight's show. I think it's going to, address a number of issues that we've never talked about on the show before. And I apologize, I was just scarfing down my dinner. I don't know if that's a modern word or an acceptable word for a podcast, but busy time here in the Franson household, which we may or may not get into on tonight's show. But tonight's guest is named Gregory Coles. He is a writer, a speaker, and a language scholar, which we'll unpack a little bit as we go along, whose work sits at the intersection of faith, identity, and words. He is the author of Single, Gay, Christian, and No Longer Strangers, as well as The Limits of My World. He was about to publish a forthcoming, an academic book on sexuality beyond sex, but that project is on hold at the moment. We'll talk about that as well. Greg holds a PhD in English from Penn State, lives in Boise, Idaho, where he writes, edits, and leads worship at his local church. Whether in memoir, theology, or literary scholarship, he invites readers into honest, nuanced conversations about belonging, sexuality, and the stories our words tell about who we are. Let's welcome Greg into the studio.
Hey, Wade, thanks for having me here.
Welcome, Greg. It's a pleasure. We've been working on doing this show for six weeks, 2 months, longer, and here we are. So, as we always like to do on the show, we'd like to know a little bit about your background and get to know the real you. So, going back to who your parents were, where you were born, the forces that shaped you before you became more aware and took conscious thought on the direction in life. And in your case, this may be particularly interesting and relevant. So if you don't mind, the floor is yours to tell us what it was like growing up, Greg.
Yeah, so my parents both grew up in upstate New York. And when I say upstate, I mean way far from the city. My dad grew up on a dairy farm, and my mom's family lived a little more in the city. She moved there when they were in 4th grade. They were in the same part of New York, the Binghamton area, but didn't know each other until college, when they both went up to a college that's kind of right on the border of Canada at the very top of New York State. And somewhere in high school was when both of them, in various ways, had kind of meaningful encounters with their faith and felt like, oh, we're really interested in this Jesus guy. We want to take this Jesus guy seriously. So they both became part of the late stage East Coast manifestation of the Jesus movement, which was kind of like the Jesus hippies of the, started in the 60s, but they were part of the 70s East Coast expression. And my dad had long hair and would like wear a wooden cross around his neck and preach on the steps of the student union. My mom had really short hair and like bought whole wheat flour in bulk and made a lot of granola. So they were kind of living that part of life. I came into the story I'm the 4th of 4 kids. And right after I was born, well, even before I was born, my dad had begun toying with the idea of talking with more people about Jesus, and he was like, this upstate New York thing is great, but he especially loved having conversations about faith with Muslims, because he was getting to know more of the folks at the local mosque where we lived up in New York. And so at some point, he kind of started to feel like, oh, we should move somewhere that has way more Muslims than upstate New York if I'm enjoying these conversations so much. So
if I may, what did he enjoy? What did he enjoy about those particular conversations? I'm just curious.
I think for him, it was a combination of, he really appreciated the fact that there was so much common ground in these two Abrahamic faiths, coming from the Christian tradition and then the Muslim tradition, both traditions that think Jesus is a really important figure, both traditions that share a lot of understanding around the events that happen through much of the Old Testament, or through, much of the earlier part of the Quran. And so he appreciated the combination of that much common ground with some really interesting and significant differences in the way he and they thought about who the divine is, what it means to join that journey. So he was just like, these are such interesting, fruitful conversations. So he was like, we should go somewhere with a lot of Muslims. And I think my mother was not initially such a fan of the idea, but eventually she too kind of developed her own sense of like, oh yeah, that's actually a really great idea for us. So we wound up moving to the nation that has the most Muslims by population in the world, which is Indonesia. And we moved there. I think we made the decision to move when I was like 1 year old. And so clearly I was not an active part of the decision making. But we moved there when I was 3, and then I proceeded to grow up in Indonesia from age 3 to age 18. So we lived on the island of Java, which has about half of Indonesia's population. And we lived in a city called Bandung, which is a city of about 2 million people. So that was where I lived, for 15 years, from age 3 to age 18 when I moved back to the US for college.
Fascinating. So I'm really intrigued by this, and I didn't know this about you. Did your fascination with words and language perhaps come from some of this?
I think that is one of the early places that I trace it to, is just recognizing some of the similarities and then some of the meaningful differences between these two languages, even recognizing, as somebody who grew up speaking both of them, recognizing even the ways in which my brain would feel like it worked a bit differently when I was using English than when I was using Indonesian, which made me really fascinated with things like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this idea that the language we're speaking sort of has the capacity to shape and limit the ways that we're capable of thinking. I think from a pretty young age, that was just a really compelling notion to me, that hopping between different ways of framing the world linguistically, grammatically, those different ways of framing actually really significantly shape how we choose to then interact with the materialities of the world.
Well, oversimplified perhaps, but isn't language an operating system? And so different languages would be different operating systems?
I think, if anything, one of the perhaps good things about what we're seeing with generative AI now, and the ways it's kind of having capacity with language, is that it does do exactly that, treat language as an operating system, and it's pretty good at it, in addition to being, somewhat harrowingly bad at it. But absolutely. There is a sense in which you just pick a mode, and the mode you pick is going to change how you engage.
Wow. Okay, so 18, you return, your whole family returned to the US, or you decided, or what happened?
No, so all of my siblings and I are born 3 years apart, and we did this thing where our family would go on furlough back to the US once every 3 years, just to kind of, refresh. It was good for Indonesia. They liked, for visa purposes, for my parents to be out of the country for a little while. So every 3 years, we would go back and just drop a sibling off in college. Not that we were all forced to go to college, but we all wanted to go to college, and the educational systems were such that we just felt like we could get a better college education in the US. So that was so when I turned 18, it was just my time to be dropped off in the US. So my parents continued to live in Indonesia for maybe another 10-ish years after that.
Wow.
And so I moved to the US, and and went to a small liberal arts college in Western New York called Roberts Wesleyan. Studied communication there, and really got particularly fascinated with rhetorical theory, with the study of how persuasion happens and how we shape words and words shape us. I got very obsessed with that. Then took a year right after undergrad. I worked for a church for 1 year, and then I started graduate school at Penn State.
Very cool. And during that time, what was arising in terms of the focal point of tonight's show, and this identity that you're attempting to communicate with I'd say mixed results, given the way different people use words and labels and try to define us?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So to rewind the story just a little bit, one of the things that's happening as I'm, growing up overseas and growing up in a family that takes faith seriously and kind of trying to figure out what does my own faith journey look like. One of the things that was happening as I hit puberty, because I grew up in a church context, which meant that I grew up going to youth group. And sometimes in youth group, they would split the boys and the girls up, which invariably meant when they split us up, it meant that we were going to talk about sex. And I have no idea what they told the girls, but they'd get the boys together and they'd be like, look, boys, we know what you're all going through. You want to look at pictures of naked women, but don't do it. And I was like, got it. No looking at pictures of naked women. And I don't mean to brag, but I discovered that I was remarkably good at not looking at pictures of naked women. Like, I was so good at it that I started to feel like I was just the holiest 12-year-old in the world, because they were like, this is every man's struggle. You're all going through it. And I was like, I think I've been spared because I just love Jesus so much. So it took me a little while then to realize, I haven't been spared the experience of human sexuality. I actually do have a sexual orientation. It's just not the one that I've been like trained and braced for. And so very quickly shifted from feeling like the holiest 12-year-old in the world to feeling like the worst possible 12-year-old in the world. The one that was so bad that nobody bothered to warn me.
That's quite a whiplash, right? Unpardonable sin, like.
Yeah, very much so. And so that led to some seasons of really significant wrestling through what that would mean for my life. Was I, as some people around me were saying, did I just need to pray and figure out what had gone wrong with my upbringing and kind of, follow sort of the model of the ex-gay movement? Maybe that would be my story. Or would I have a story that was like some of the more progressive movements within Christianity and come to find a space within my faith for pursuing a same-sex marriage as a follower of Jesus? Or was my sexuality so at odds with my Christian faith that I just needed to leave Christianity altogether? So I sort of grappled with all of those questions over the course of, I spent a long time kind of tacitly assuming the ex-gay model, just sort of praying and waiting and hoping to become straight, to become the thing that I thought I needed to be in order to be a follower of Jesus. And over the course of middle school and high school and college and slightly after college, it became increasingly clear that that was not what was happening. That I was, in fact, growing in my faith insofar as I could discern it. I was falling more deeply in love with the person of Jesus as well as I could conceive of it. And yet those things were not changing my experience of sexuality. So then I spent a while grappling with the texts of scripture around sexual ethics and sort of major arguments in all directions. And what does it look like for me if I take Jesus seriously in the ways he's revealed in this text? What does it look like for me with respect to my body, my sexuality, to be his follower? And ultimately, somewhat begrudgingly, I landed in a place of feeling like, okay, I don't think God is making me straight, but I also, even though I've got lots of dear friends who have come to a place of feeling comfortable pursuing Jesus and also pursuing a same-sex relationship, I just found that I couldn't get there theologically, that I wasn't finding space in the way that I understood scripture to pursue a same-sex relationship. And so I sort of, between those two things, felt like, well, if I'm not going to be attracted to a woman and I don't have room in my theology for marriage to a man, then I guess I'll just be single and celibate. And initially, I mean, I landed in this conclusion, again, somewhat begrudgingly. But my plan, kind of like the deal that I had with God, I was like, look, God, I think I'm willing to do this if this is actually the thing that you want. But the one thing that I want from you, I would just like to die and have nobody realize that I'm gay, which clearly at this point in my life has worked out very well for me. But yeah, a couple years after sort of tentatively landing in that place and saying, good, I think I'll just hang out here in singleness and I'll be really evasive anytime somebody asks me a question. Eventually there came a time when I realized I actually think maybe there's an invitation to step into this conversation more. And really what happened was I was trying to write a different book. I was trying to write a novel, and I had terrible writer's block. And my agent said to me, look, Coles, you just need to open a blank Word document and write whatever comes out of you, and no one ever has to see it. So I took his advice because it seemed like sound writerly advice. And I did. And I, over the course of that summer, wound up just having this thing flow out of me that at the end of the summer, I looked at it and I was like, oh, shoot, I think I wrote a book. And so that book became my coming out, which brings us into this conversation.
Wow. There's so much there to unpack. I made a couple of notes, and we're going to go to a quick commercial break, which is a little video that you've provided to sort of segue into the next segment. We'll unpack some of this and dig into it and discuss it, what it means, and talk about your books and so much more when we come back right after this commercial break. For the audience, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Greg Coles on Created in the Image of God.
Some of the best coming out conversations that I've had are with people who invite me not just to think about the things I need to say no to, but also to consider what I get to say yes to as somebody who is gay and celibate and loves Jesus. I think we can't just tell a narrative for gay folks in the church about the sexual desires that they will abstain from. We need to find a way in which loving Jesus as a gay person gives us unique opportunities to love Jesus well and to love others well. And I think the best coming out conversations that I've had are those in which people are willing to consider that positive narrative with me, to consider the ways in which God might delight over my unique story.
Sorry, I took a bite of my dinner during that video, and it was shorter than I thought.
I was so pleased to see that you're getting some sustenance. This is really great news for us all.
Well, so I think, there are so many things in life that are not coincidences. I'm going to tell a little story now by way of going into this next segment. Earlier today, I saw on Facebook a little article somebody posted about this woman who in 1910 or something like that was put into a mental institution by her husband. And the story goes, she was simply, she had her own ideas. They were different from her husband's. Back in that day, a husband could sign his wife away. All it took was one signature. She got into the mental institution and she found out the other people there were women who were not mentally ill. So this was a thing. You could get rid of your wife. And then I didn't fully read it all, but I got the gist of it real quick. She came through that articulately overturning this in later court cases. She turned this into an opportunity. The way in which, so that reminded me of one of my favorite verses. In fact, my second book is titled after this, The Hardness of the Heart. This is my own dealings with, relationships, marriage, divorce. My audience knows, I think I may have shared with you, I was kidnapped as a child in a domestic kidnapping, smuggled out of the country. And this case eventually went to the Supreme Court of Sweden because the Swedish courts awarded my father custody rather than my mother, and he was a Swedish citizen. It's a long story, not the point. That phrase, the hardness, comes from Matthew 19. And so on this Facebook post, I responded with, sounds like Matthew 19, where the Pharisees tried to trap Jesus by asking him, hey, Moses said we could kick our wives to the curb. What do you say? And because I was sort of irreverent in the way that I used that phrase, kick our wives to the curb, I thought I'd go read the actual passage. And for whatever reason, I noticed something I never noticed before. So I'm going to go through it real quick. Matthew 19, marriage and divorce. The Pharisees also came, and this is the New King James Version, came to him, testing him and saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And I sometimes think that interjected just any reason is not wrong. I think, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, period? Not the way it's phrased, it makes it sound like for frivolous reasons. No, is it lawful to divorce at all? But regardless of that, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'm sure you've read it 1,000 times on your journey. So then they who are no longer two, but one flesh, therefore what God hath joined together, let not man separate. They said, well, then why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? In other words, there's a law that says you can do this. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And that phrase from the beginning is the one I love, because I love to go back to the beginning. I've asked many times. I'll ask you, and you can think about it. We'll maybe talk about this later. When God came to Adam and Eve and said, who told you you were naked? He's not saying who let the cat out of the bag. it's I thought I didn't want you to realize that. Right? Something else is going on with that very gentle question. Who told you were naked? Who introduced shame in you when I created you perfect and beautiful? But there's more here, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. This is the part that never really struck me. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. In other words, they went along with this approach. What, we can't kick our wives to the curb? We're stuck with them? It's kind of shocking, isn't it? That is just, better not marry at all. The penny never dropped on their reaction on that.
Sure.
That's a really hard road. There's no way out. But then he said, and then the next part is Jesus teaches on celibacy. And this is why I thought I'd bring this up here. All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. So I was reading this today from a completely different perspective. And it suddenly occurred to me, wow, I was just marveling at this passage and what it means and how I've never really fully understood it. And now we're having this conversation about celibacy. So I just thought I'd throw it out there, and because I'm sure you've read this passage many times from your perspective and have pondered it on your journey.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, some of the things that stand out to me in the passage as a whole, one of them certainly, it was important for me in my own journey to see the way that, in this conversation where Jesus has the opportunity to sort of weigh in on like, well, what is marriage? What's it supposed to look like? It did feel significant to me that he names this like created reality of both male and female reflecting the image of God. And And so that was one of the things that in my sort of hopeful journey to be like, maybe I can like find room in my faith for a same-sex marriage. Again, one of the things that kind of stood in my way was it felt like Jesus is so interested in the way that both male and female differently reflect the totality of who God is, that there's like something missing about the image of God if we only look at males and say those are the image of God, or only look at females.
Absolutely.
And Jesus seems so interested in this excuse me, this joining together of the two. So that was significant in a way. But then right after that sort of gut punch of like, oh man, I was really hoping I could just pursue a same-sex marriage, and now I feel sort of stuck in singleness, there was then this sort of beautiful, what I felt was a really beautiful encouragement to see, number one, to see once Jesus talks about marriage, instead of the disciples saying what a lot of, I felt like the religious community around me was saying, which is like, yeah, any loser should get married. Like, unless you're total scum, like you should obviously get married. That's what everybody does if they want any fulfillment in life. Like, the disciples hear Jesus teach on marriage and they're like, gosh, maybe fewer of us should get married. And that was sort of encouraging. And then it was encouraging that Jesus has this sense of like a positive vision for the eunuch, right? The person who in the ancient Near East mind is missing out on life by not leaving behind descendants. And Jesus actually says, no, this is a kind of word that's given to a specific group of people. Right? There are the ones who just kind of come out this way, and there are the ones who are sort of forced into it. And then there are the ones who choose to live this way, for the sake of the kingdom. And that invitation to accept it, it made my own celibacy feel much less like kind of a second class thing that I sort of had to settle into because I couldn't achieve the better thing. And instead, it made it seem much more like something that my faith had actually cast this really beautiful vision for. And I mean, that's not to say that I always find celibacy the easiest thing in the world, but it does give me a certain kind of delightedness within my vocation that I think without Jesus addressing it in this way, I would have a much harder road ahead of me, I think.
Amen to that. So I often refer to walking the razor's edge. What I mean by that is, Jesus' statement, for example, straight is the way and narrow is the path. Few there are that find it, right? The straight and narrow. Or the Beatles, as the Beatles might call it, the long and winding road. Might not be straight in that sense, but it's walking the razor's edge. Another way of looking at it is threading the needle. And as you get older and your eyes don't work quite as well, and maybe your fingers, threading a needle becomes even harder, right? And threading the needle of performing what it is that we're really intended to, it's a tightrope act. Sure. So I guess I'm asking, is the path you've taken unique? Do you know others? Because it seems to me there are a lot of people that veer over here or veer over here and are very adamant. Sure. There's the word pride attached to it. They're very adamant. Sure. On either side about this is the way, walk ye in it. But Jesus's way, he says his burden is light. And I get that feeling with you that you've found a way in which this isn't the burden so much as an opportunity and even a joy, if I dare say. Is that rare? Is that unique? Or have you found others who resonate with that?
Yeah, I think the sort of like middle space that I live in, that's sort of like neither pursuing same-sex relationship nor being like, this is why you got to pray it out of you. It's definitely I would say in my experience, it's the numerically least common of the paths available. And to be clear, like I said before, like I've got people I really love who would fit into both of those camps. So I don't want to disparage either one of them.
I'm trying very hard not to, but I'm really honored to be meeting somebody who said, no, this is the path I've chosen and I'm happy in this path.
Yeah. I will say, I think when I first came out, I had this sense, I felt as if I was the only one. I was the only one I had ever met. at the moment that I came out. And so that felt like a pretty lonely place to be. One of the interesting things about telling the story, and telling the story as I have chosen to do it in a fairly public way, is that you wind up meeting more people who have similar stories, even if they're people who don't have the same luxury of being able to be as public with that story as I've been able to be. And so I now know literally hundreds of folks who have the same story. In fact, in about a month from now, maybe a month from today, actually, I'll be speaking at a conference that's going to be a couple hundred people, and it's primarily a conference by and for LGBTQ and same-sex attracted folks who are in sort of this same theological camp that I'm in. So there really are, and I mean, that's just a small slice of like the people that I've had the privilege of connecting with, both in the US and globally. So I know there are many more of us. Again, I think before I started talking about it, I had this sense that it was incredibly rare. And now that I've started talking about it, I feel like, oh, this is all over the place. I don't think most churches that I step into, I think I wind up finding at least one other person who has some kind of similar story.
So when you told that little piece of it, I was immediately reminded of Elijah, right? Who stood on the mountain, called down fire from heaven. And then we, cut to the next scene, and Elijah's hiding out in this cave saying, I'm the only one. And they're trying to kill me. And then one of the things that God tells him is, Elijah, there are 7,000 that you don't know about. Not a huge number, but it's intended to be an impactful number.
Sure. Yeah.
To Elijah. It's like, really? There are 7,000 that I could introduce you to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I think
the reason I bring that up is this whole idea of story, because to me, that's an important story. Both sides of that story are for me really important, and they've kind of guided my life. On the one hand, that glory moment. And then on the other hand, and if you look at the story of Elijah, it's my understanding that God gave him 3 things to do after that were very unpleasant, one of which is appoint your successor because I'm done with you. So there's a yin yang thing going on here. Sure. A big high and then a big low in our journey. So anyway, I guess I'm segueing into the idea of story and words and your degree, and how does that relate to your journey? Not to cut you off, because I think you were about to say something.
No.
Earlier.
Oh, I was just going to resonate with one of the ways in which I resonate with the story of Elijah is you feel especially like the only one when it seems like the criticism coming in on you is very loud. I think, the voices that feel loudest, sometimes I think have a way of occluding our accurate vision of what the world looks like and who actually maybe is much closer to us in posture and experience than we even realize. So I resonate with Elijah's pessimism in that moment. And I also appreciate the kindness of God to be like, you're not as alone as you think you are. But getting to your really good question just about the way this shapes, like the stories that we tell and the words that we're using to tell those stories. One of the things that was such a source of angst for me when I decided to share this story more publicly was realizing there were certain ways of telling the story. There were sets of words that I wanted to use or not use when I was talking with one group of people versus when I was talking with another group of people. So for instance, at the time that I came out, I was both in a fairly traditional evangelical Protestant church community, and I was a worship leader in that community, so I was a recognizable figure. And I knew here's the way of telling the story that's most likely to make this group of people feel most at ease. Some of them will dislike it regardless, but like there are ways of telling the story that could work better for them, so to speak. Meanwhile, I was in a graduate program at Penn State in the humanities. And many of my friends were also part of the LGBTQ plus community. Most were not people of any faith. And a few had really traumatic experiences with a Christian faith community that caused them to then move away from that faith community. And so I recognized, oh man, there are so many pitfalls. There's a way that I can talk about my experience that's maximally likely to help those folks understand where I'm coming from, the amount of love and affection that I feel for them. And I sort of want to tell a really different story. I want to tell the same story, but I would tell it so differently if I was talking to these people or talking to those people. I don't know if that makes sense. And so that wrestling in the way that I talked about sexuality has then sort of like expanded in my thinking, where I started to realize, oh, there are so many ways in which it's not just the way we have conversations about sexuality and faith and the intersection of those things, but it's also how we have conversations about what it means to live in a democratic society. It's how we have conversations about what it means to recognize the reality of race in the world. There are so many things that are like these hot button things that we talk about. And as soon as we start to put words around it, people will very easily hear within our words, oh, you're on my team or you are not on my team. And so just that grappling with like, what do we do when language that's supposed to be the thing that brings us together has also become this thing that immediately indicates for us whose team I'm on and whose team I'm not on. So that angst, is ever present, I think, not just in navigating this conversation, but in the way I think about all kinds of words that we're using, which in some ways really inspired, the studies that I was doing in my PhD at Penn State too.
Yeah, one of the words that I've thought about recently is this word othering, right? Because the minute you use that word, to some tiny degree, or perhaps to a very large degree, what you are saying is this: I, or we, don't other people the way those other people.
Sure.
You can't really use that word without that implication.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's not to say that we should other people. we shouldn't other people, right? But you're saying it because you're saying that other people are othering people. And many times it's your assumption about those people, right? There used to be this common phrase in Christianity, hate the sin, but love the sinner, right?
Yes.
And that's a hard, so, maybe there's a better way of saying that, but personally, to me, and maybe it's an oversimplification, but personally to me, that still resonates. Because sin, which is not, which is a horrible word today, we hate that word, although it's all over the Bible. Sin hurts. Sin kills. Sin destroys. Sin disturbs, disrupts, and I hate that. I hate what it does to people. You follow me?
Sure.
And I've seen a lot of it in my lifetime. I've participated in it, right? There are some things that I did. There's one particular, there are a few things in my life that I often reflect on, how could I possibly have done that? One time there's a letter that I wrote when I was a college student. I wrote it to a girl who had been at this youth camp that I was at, and she wrote me this letter. And I responded just really very mean-spiritedly and vicious to try to correct her and help her see, what I saw, which is you're going down a wrong path. You follow me? And and I deeply, deeply regret having written and sent that letter to this girl. You follow me? It was a horrible thing to do, and that's a minor thing there. So I'll stop there and just let you react and respond to what I'm addressing here.
Yeah. I think that phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, or vice versa, hate the sin, love the sinner, is a really good example of the kind of language that I think can speak to something really true and good in the world, or speak to something really false and problematic in the world. And one of the things I've experienced about that phrase is that it tends to locate people within a certain kind of cultural camp. And so, for instance, my emotional experience of that phrase, like when I hear you say it, I immediately feel a bit of a visceral, like, oh, in large part because I have mostly encountered that phrase from straight conservative Christians talking about gay people. And
well, and in fairness to you and full disclosure, yeah, it does tend to come up in those conversations.
Sure, yeah, and one of the things that that's interesting about the use of that phrase in those conversations is that I often experience the people who are using it as people who seem much more interested in the potential sexual sinfulness of people who are not like them than they are in the potential sexual sinfulness of themselves and people who are like them. And it reminds me a little bit of how in the first chapter of Romans, as Paul is sort of like gearing his readers up to be like, look at all these things that are very sinful. And interestingly, among the things he appears at least to mention in the text is same-sex sexual behavior. But he has all of this, like, observe these sins. And then he moves to the beginning of chapter 2, and he says to the reader, you therefore have no excuse, you who cast judgment on someone else, because at whatever point you judge, you yourself stand condemned, because you who judge do the very same things.
Well, exactly. The whole book of Matthew, to me, the pivot verse of Matthew, and we read from Matthew earlier, is Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not, lest ye be judged. Whatever standard of judgment you use, that's how you're going to be judged. And if we carry that through in the book of Matthew and get to Matthew 25, the separation of the sheep and the goats, that verse says that when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will separate the sheep from the goats, and he will address the nations, not the peoples of the nations, not individuals. He will address nations and judge them. And to me, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is how the world declared it will be judged. And that is the standard that God is using to judge it today. So it's not that when you come before God, he's going to actually judge you against the 10 commandments at all, or any other particular scriptural standard. He's going to say, and this is why that letter that I wrote, you wrote that letter to that girl. Remember that letter? Yeah, I remember that letter. And
yeah. One of the things that stands out to me in what you're saying is just the reality that the best way I think for us to think about sin is to be primarily concerned with its manifestations in our own life and heart.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's why I sort of rankle a bit against the phrase love the sin or hate the sin, not because it's theologically untrue, but because it so often seems to turn the focus toward that sin which is external to us rather than
it's like that phrase. No, thank you. This was really helpful. I never really considered it. It has the same quality as that othering. The minute you say that, you've got the 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. You're pointing a finger, the saying, you point a finger at somebody, there's 3 pointing back at yourself. The minute you say that, you've condemned yourself. So don't say it. Don't use that phrase, because all you're doing is condemning yourself. Who the blank do you think you are to ever say such a thing? I guess is my reaction now after talking to you about it.
What a fun journey to go on with you, Wade.
Well, this show is about me learning from my guests, to be honest.
I love that.
That's why I do this show. That's why I love doing this show. I love to sit down with my guests. So, okay, let's get back to this phrase, this story, who told you you were naked?
Mm.
And that, what's God getting at there? Why that particular question from a person who is, a scholar in language and words?
Oh, yeah. You know, one of the things I find so fascinating about that story, because this inquiry, "Who told you you were naked?" comes right after in the Genesis 3 narrative. It comes right after the very first thing that God asks the man and the woman, which is, "Where are you?" Um, which is a fascinating thing for like an all-knowing God to ask, like, because clearly, at least in my theological understanding, God is clearly not like needing information from them. Um, and so what's fascinating is that this impulse of shame has driven them to hide themselves from God. And so the thing that God is trying to solicit, as far as I understand it, with this first question, "Where are you?" is not, "I need some information from you," but it's like, I want you to take the bold move of locating yourself to me, even when everything within you wants to hide away. And so within that setting of like, what has suddenly been introduced to the human condition is the impulse to hide ourselves away rather than to be sort of like vulnerably seen and known by the one who loves us. And it seems to me within that context, then this follow-up question, "Who told you you were naked?" Takes on this extra layer of like, oh, well, if you've gotten the sense that there is within your nakedness something that needs to be hidden from me, that's clearly not something that you gained from your created nature. It's clearly not something that I have handed to you, God says. And so that question of like, where does this idea come from, if not from me? One of the things that I think is so moving to me about that, as I think about the way we now live our stories, is that I think the invitation of God to each of us now is still the same as that garden invitation that he's giving, which is to say, like, I want you to locate yourself to me. Like, however much shame makes you feel like you need to withdraw away from the divine, the invitation of the divine is actually like to lean in, to be fully known, and to let those parts of our story that feel most like they are at risk of separating us from God actually be the things that drive us into a kind of vulnerability and openness that deepens our intimacy. And I think that's where, despite, I've definitely gotten some less than positive responses to the fact that I've been quite open with my own story around sexuality. And yet for me, it's been such a significant part of my own growth in faith to be able to come to own that story and to say, look, this is a thing that I felt such significant shame about in my life. And yet instead of doing what I tried to do for so much of my life, which is kind of stuff it down, keep it away, make sure that nobody else found out about it, and ideally have a relationship with God in which that was just kind of like a non-issue, it's been really revolutionary to instead say, no, the being known, the letting yourself be seen by God, and along the way, letting yourself be seen with the people who reflect God's image to you, that's actually such a necessary part of what it means to grow back into the kind of intimacy with God for which we were created in the first place.
Yeah, it's amazing just listening to you unpack that. One of the things that I was thinking is, one way to look at it is perhaps God saying, hey, I've missed you. We used to have these wonderful conversations. What's going on?
Right?
Oh,
that's beautiful.
And then of course, God saw them in their nakedness, and he never introduced any shame. It didn't come from him.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So who told you? What wavelength are you tuning into? To, where's this guilt and shame coming from?
Yeah. Yeah.
And to your point earlier about, the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. So much of our guilt and shame does come from religion and the way in which it approaches us, the way in which it is carried out, the way in which it is taught. One of the reasons, so I was a pastor and I resigned from the ministry in 1995. My purpose was to separate my faith from my paycheck. But it was also, I had an autoimmune condition that got worse while I was in the ministry.
Wow.
And I was offered temporary disability and then permanent disability. It's called ankylosing spondylitis. It was literally my body attacking itself. I was diagnosed with this when the third time I had a very serious iritis, which was my immune system actually attacking my eye.
Oh, wow.
And I was about to go blind in that eye. And when I got cortisone injections and they identified what was going on, and this was in a clinic in Germany. But it's partly that it's being in that role, which today I see there's this thing about being a minister, right? Where you're truly ministering. But then there's this thing about being in the office, right? Of a minister where you have responsibility, or maybe you assume responsibility that maybe you don't have. You assume responsibilities, right? Again, this is just my own personal journey in unpacking all this, trying to figure it out. But sometimes the more successful I was in my sermons and in my counseling, the more people looked to me and wanted me to give them answers and give them guidance.
Yeah.
And my reaction was, well, you need to pray and read your Bible. You need to, I can't tell you, I'm not God. I don't know what God wants for you or has in store for you, or I can't advise you because I don't know. I can barely advise myself on how I should go with this path. So anyway, that direct relationship with God, and it's kind of like when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was glowing after his encounter with God, and they made him put a veil over his face because it made everybody uncomfortable. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you.
So we're let's see where we're at with the clock here. We're gonna go to a quick commercial break because we're probably going to go overtime a little bit tonight, if that's okay with you.
Bring it on.
All right, so we're gonna go to a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll invite you to wrap up that segment of your life. We haven't really talked about your books, and then ask, where are you growing next? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Greg Coles on Created in the Image of God.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth. God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
So that book, Facets of One, I've got to do a little additional promo for that. That book was actually inspired by visits that my wife and I do every week to a nursing home. And there were some folks there who wanted somebody to come in and talk to them about the Bible. And then there was a gentleman who identified as a Hindu. He was formerly a Christian. And he loved meeting with us, and he called us his spiritual family. And we introduced other faiths to make sure that anyone in that facility felt welcome there. And I asked the question about the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. And I thought, is that unique? Sounded like it was kind of unique, that would be one thing you probably wouldn't find in the other religions. And I was shocked at how closely they track to that, but just from a different perspective and angle. And even I talked to a gentleman recently who I was sharing this theologian. I won't go into detail, a prominent one who works in bridge building and whatnot. So I thought he might have more of an interfaith approach. He's a Christian. And he said, yeah, but the Tao, the Tao and Buddhism, why do you have them in there? They don't believe in God. And I read to him from the book. Here's a hardcover version of it. It's just out, by the way. And one of my favorite ones in the first set of quotes is the Tao. And here's what it says. This is a familiar passage to some. There was something undifferentiated and yet complete, which existed before heaven and earth. And to me, that's like right out of Genesis 1:1 and 1:2.
That's fascinating.
Spirit of God hovered above the waters, right? But here's the part I love the most. I do not know its name. I term it the way. And I said, didn't Jesus say he was the way?
That's really interesting. Yeah.
So how is this not saying the same thing? Something complete and undifferent one that existed or anything else. I don't even know its name. And then, of course, you have this thing, you talked about Islam and Muslims earlier. We're like, come on, Allah. You say Allah isn't God. It's the Arabic word for God.
Well, and speaking of language, in the Indonesian language, Allah is just like, that's the categorical, that's what you call any God. So the Christian God is referred to as Allah. Technically, generally, when Indonesians are referring to Allah of the Muslim tradition, they'll say it more like Allah. But same spelling. It is literally the same word. So yeah, it speaks. I mean, those sound like some fascinating conversations that you must get into with that compilation.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's just, I mean, we're just rolling this out. It's being used in different parts, and we had a scientist who's not religious, and she was in awe. She's like, I've never heard this, and this was in the nursing home, right? So she's retired, and she was so fascinated. She kept asking us, where is this tradition from? Where is it? She wanted to know the origin and the countries of, and they all say the same thing. I can't believe this. Why have I never heard this? So yeah, it's wonderful. Okay, but back over to you. So in the time we have left, tell us a little bit about the books and the, sort of that journey that you're on and the arc of it. It sounds like it came about in stages to get to where you're at and really comfortable. And was there a phase where you were like tongue-tied and unable to express what it is that you were seeing and feeling and didn't find the words? And what was that like?
Yeah.
In terms of your own story.
Yeah. Well, I think so it's
because
notable.
It is a minefield, right? It's a minefield that you're walking through every day.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm walking on eggs even talking about it, and it's not about me.
I think for me that season of not knowing what to say and most feeling like I was navigating the minefield was when I was in that season just before coming out of being in a graduate program where I'm having these conversations, including about faith and about sexual identity with dear friends in my graduate program, at the same time that I'm talking with my Christian community about these things. And I started to recognize in some ways it's really hard to do this honestly without telling my story. But in other ways, the moment I begin to tell my story, everything's just going to kind of explode. And so I had a lot of pent up, untold story that I was like, I don't know what to do with this, which, then ultimately is what blossomed into that first book, Single Gay Christian. And that book, it should be noted, my public coming out, I came out with the book. I mean, literally, I came out on Facebook by taking the pre-order link to the book, posting it to Facebook, and writing, I'm delighted to announce that I have a book coming out. Also, a few other things you should know. Like, that was just how I shared the story.
So what were the reaction of the people closest to you? Or did some of them know, actually?
Before I did that, I made a list actually of about 100 people in my life from various seasons, folks I knew from Indonesia, from college, from the year I worked at the church, from my life then in graduate school in Pennsylvania, and listed about 100 of those folks that I felt like, to honor sort of the significance that relationship has had to me at some point along the way, this is a conversation I need to have before I just say, look, here's a book. So I sent a lot of emails. I made some phone calls. I had some coffee dates. And by and large, those turned out to be really beautiful conversations, in addition to some really deeply painful ones. It was sort of, I've described that season of my life as like playing relational roulette, that I won most of the time, but the fact that I occasionally didn't win made every conversation, even the ones that I went into knowing like this is going to be okay, they still felt like they had this fragility to them, just because I knew, yeah, but not all of these conversations have turned out beautifully. So that, yeah, it was a source of, it was the end of some relationships, and it was the deepening of some other relationships. And I had to find ways to sort of celebrate and grieve all of that at the same time, to say, oh my gosh, how beautiful is it that so many of these people I love now know me yet better to love me yet better. And also, how much does it suck that some of these people I have loved and continue to love, there's now kind of a pall over the relationship in some ways. So that book was, some years of, yeah, there was some relational fallout to be navigated in the first couple of years after that book. But then I moved from there. In some ways, the track of my publishing actually tracks really well kind of the course of my life, because my second book, No Longer Strangers, is really just about what it means to find belonging in a world where you feel out of place. And I was recognizing, I've been out of place since, growing up in Indonesia, I felt out of place. Then I moved back to the US and I felt out of place for different reasons. The being gay thing has made me feel out of place in a lot of faith communities. But the being a person of, convicted faith and pursuing celibacy makes me feel very out of place in certain pockets of the LGBTQ community. And I'm just kind of like doing this whole lifey thing with a lot of like, oh, I'm weird. And so that book was a chance for me to kind of grapple out loud with the question of like, what does it look like for me to find a sense of settledness and a sense of place, even when the story that I tell very much makes me look like an oddity in a lot of my circles. And then from there, I had the privilege of kind of spinning off into my book, The Limits of My World, which is my only novel of my books so far. And it's a science fiction novel, science fiction being in many ways my favorite genre to ask big philosophical questions. And that's where I got to wrestle with the same kinds of questions I was wrestling with in graduate school about how do we honor language and its complexity and the ways that picking language often makes us feel like we're picking a team. How does that sort of bring us even back to the narrative of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 and the notion that the breakdown of our ability to communicate is actually part and parcel of what it means to navigate the mess of the world now. So in many ways, I describe The Limits of My World as like a science fictional fan fiction of the Tower of Babel.
Wow. So I now earlier earlier when I was writing down questions, I wrote down the Tower of Babel, right? Because to me, that is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible, and I think it's grossly underestimated in terms of its importance and its prominence, because, and I'll just now I'll come out. I think I may have shared this. The audience knows I actually am a Baha'i. So in the Baha'i faith, there's a precursor. There's sort of a John the Baptist like figure called the Bab, and his title is the Gate of God, Babel, which is the city that Nimrod built, the Gate of God. And God came down to look at the tower that was being built in that city. And he said, this isn't Babel, this is Babel. That's the pun. That's the play on words that God used. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, Nimrod was erecting a tower, which was a symbol of what? Dominance, control. There was unity in conformity. But there was no unity in diversity, and it wasn't a voluntary thing. The modern metaphor, in my view, and my third book, The Rod of Iron, actually gets into this. So I asked the question, if you built the tower to heaven, how high would it really have had to have been? Let's get scientific. How high would it have been? Well, if it reached the moon, I have the sun and the moon behind me here. If it reached the moon, it would have reached heaven, because God said he put the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the night and rule the day. And if we submit to the light, we retain our sovereignty. And if we deviate from the light, we become enslaved to each other, to something. These are fundamental principles that I've gleaned from constant study of the book of Genesis. And so if the tower if the tower had been to the moon, he would have accomplished his goal. Well, then you have in this modern day, you have a space race of who would get to the moon. And you have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is a godless entity. And then you have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, the United States of America. And in the United States of America, you actually had this melting pot, and all these different nationalities became one, and they all learned a common language. And America won the space race and built the Tower to Heaven. And so in the Baha'i faith, again, in the 1800s, you have this person called the Babel, Gate of God. And one of the things he said is there will be a universal language. And when I encountered the Baha'i faith, I'm like, well, that's fascinating, because wasn't that forbidden at Babel? God said, no, I'm not going to let it happen. And he confused the languages. And they're like, no, it has nothing to do with that. I'm like, come on, it has to have something to do with that. And so I've made my own study of it to dig into it. So I'm fascinated. So having said all that, not to derail everything, but going into overtime here, this is the bonus, folks who are still listening in. What's your take on the Tower of Babel and its role and its relevance, and why did you use that metaphor? I mean, you kind of hinted at it, but now we're going deeper.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up its connection to, or its resonance with, some of what's going on now with attempting to reach the heavens and the uniting of languages, because I think to me, that notion of mixed up language making it impossible for us to actually do all of the things that, in theory, a unified humankind could be capable of.
Amen.
I see that mixing up of language as being not just true when we are speaking what linguists would understand as different languages, but also to be true when we're speaking what is ostensibly the same language. For instance, a lot of us speaking English, and yet we're speaking it in such different ways that we still experience a certain kind of intransigence in our ability to actually meaningfully communicate with one another.
Well, Winston Churchill's famous saying, right, about Great Britain and America, two nations divided by a common language. or two peoples. So
it is, yeah. Yeah, that notion that we might be speaking what is ostensibly the same language, and yet because of the difference of the ways that we choose to understand the words within it,
yeah, today
we're still
you're destroying democracy. No, you're destroying democracy.
yeah, there's a in the limits of my world, my novel, there's this passage where two groups of people are in a city, and they're both sort of protesting the situation of the city, and you know, they both have signs that say things like "Save the soul of our nation," and so this person looks out the taxi and is like, okay, this group is saving the soul of our nation. Does that make them the protesters or the counter protesters? And the taxi driver sort of shrugs and he's like, most time I just look at the color of their clothes. Because there is this sense in which they can have the same words, and yet because they've imbued them with such different meanings, what does the soul of our nation need saving from? They've found a way to still fail to communicate with one another. Yeah. And so that's a sense in which, to me, no matter how much we find ourselves all speaking English or Mandarin or whatever language finds itself, dominating the world, I have a hunch that there is built within us a kind of babblishness that will make it quite difficult for us to actually meaningfully communicate with one another, apart from the help of some very significant divine intervention.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So next on the horizon, you had a book in flight. It was a more scholarly book, an academic book. There's been a change in the nature of its publication. There was an editor. Now there's not an editor aligned. Tell us a little bit about that and what you might do. And I know it's just happened and maybe you don't have it figured out, but this is the point where we ask, okay, where are you growing next? What's next on the horizon?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so interestingly, I had two book projects that were sort of like on the horizon, in the works. And one of them is still coming to fruition. It's got a set publication date. It's all a thing. It's coming out in November. So I'll tell you about that one. But then the other one is, as you're saying, this book that was the more academic project. An editor had acquired it for a press, so we were kind of moving in that direction. And then my editor left the press, and so then the press was like, well, we don't really want this book apart from that editor. So now I'm back in the process of being like, will this book have a home? Will it ever see the light of day? Who knows? This is the journey, the upheaval of the publishing world. So these two projects, which sort of like draw from two different threads that have come up during our conversation. So a fitting note on which to land. The book that is still coming out is called Sexuality Beyond Sex. And so this is a book where it kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about the Adam and Eve, in that post fall world where they're sort of like dealing with their bodies and being like, all this shame. One of the questions that I found myself wrestling with as a single and celibate person was like, well, if I have all the correct parts and all the theoretical capacity to be having sex, and yet I'm not having sex, is there still a positive way in which I can think about my sexual embodiment? Like, what is sort of the good vision, especially, though not exclusively, for the celibate person, apart from just having sex? And so this was such an intriguing question to me. And so I wound up writing this book of dialogue. So it's a co-authored project with a Catholic friend of mine, Dr. Julia Hayduck, she's a straight married Catholic woman who's a professor of classics at Baylor University. And so the two of us kind of like parts of the book, the beginning and end of each chapter, we write together with kind of like a unified, like, here's what we're thinking, here's where we're headed. But then most of each chapter is sort of us writing back and forth and saying like, oh, I love this about what you're saying. I'm not sure I agree with that part of what you're saying. But it is just us dialoguing through this question of, what in the broadly Christian vision, how do we think positively about the body, the human capacity for sexuality apart from sex itself? So that's the November book. That one's actually happening. The book that is currently on hiatus while my agent and I figure out what could be next for it is a book project tracing the stories of derogatory terms that have been reclaimed or attempted to be reclaimed by the group of people that they derogate. So a really classic example of this, chapter 1 of the book, is the word queer, right? Which begins as this derogatory slur for LGBTQ plus folks, and then has a significant turn beginning around 1990, where an increasing number of LGBTQ plus people are using the word queer as sort of a positive thing for themselves. So this was a book that was sort of like following those word stories and trying to figure out, okay, what made this word an insult in the first place? Why did people decide to start using it positively? And what happened as a result? And how does that story tell us something about how language works, who we are as people, how we fight with words to try to build a sense of ourselves? So it was a very fun book. I mean, I absolutely adore this book, and I hope that someday people get the chance to read it. But that's the project that I'm currently figuring out whether there will be a home for.
Well, both of those books sound like fascinating reads to me, and I don't know if I'm just geeky in this way. Just I love the tension in the dialogue of trying to figure things out. I like to say that the Word of God, the revelation of God, is the curriculum, and the creation itself is the laboratory. And you get a little theory in the classroom, and then you got to go do work in the lab, and the instructor says, just don't blow anything up too badly, right? So we're out of time, but I want to at least bring in 2 audience comments real quick to kind of wrap this up. The first one is kind of about what you were just talking about language and its use. And we talked about this at the beginning. This question came in. Somebody here said they told you on Twitter X to stop identifying as a gay Christian. Only a title given to homosexuals who are in same-sex relationships, like myself, like this individual. Interesting. That's a title given. We could also say a label put upon, but whatever. You talked a little bit. I just thought maybe you should address this because maybe others have the same question.
Yeah. And it's a great question. I didn't happen to see this person's comment on Twitter/X, but maybe that's because I'm not really on there. One of the interesting things about like trying to explain my story is that there's really no language to put around it that just answers everyone's questions by default. I think no matter what language we pick, there's always going to be some messiness. I will say I tend not to use the phrase gay Christian by itself, in part because I recognize that for so many people, and it sounds like for this listener, that phrase can imply by default, oh, this is somebody who's in or pursuing a same-sex relationship. And so I tend, if I'm going to use that phrase, I tend to say celibate gay Christian just because it adds clarity. I do find, for me, because the word gay is defined in most dictionaries, I'm thinking of like Merriam-Webster and Google Dictionary and even the Oxford English, it tends to be defined primarily or even exclusively in terms of attraction or orientation toward the same sex. And so for that reason, it seems to me that it's linguistically honest. If somebody says, "Are you gay?" the linguistically honest answer, as far as I can tell, is, well, yeah. Obviously, there are some follow-up questions, and people might assume when they hear me say I'm gay, they might assume I'm pursuing a same-sex relationship. Though in fairness, I think when we hear people are straight, we also assume that they're pursuing a straight relationship. I think we just tend to assume in the 21st century Western world, and probably the 21st century other parts of the world too, we tend to assume that people are just in the process of pursuing the kind of sex they want to be having. So any of us who I think wind up being celibate for a variety of reasons, it's always going to be, I think, perhaps a little bit weird. So anyway, I resonate with this listener's concern around language. I agree it's messy, but how are we gonna keep talking to each other except with some mess,
Yeah, we live in a messy world. Thanks so much for clarifying. And then this one here, and I'll add a little twist to this. Is it gender that reflects the image of God in relation to male and female together reflect the image of God? Maybe it is the soul. I remember having questions about the differences between men and women with this one theologian I respected many years ago. The Baha'i conception is that male and female are two wings of one bird, and that's an interesting metaphor because you know you need both for the species to be able to function, and indeed, you know, procreation, right, is important aspect, but this idea of a soul, because Jesus said in you know in heaven, you know, in the kingdom of God, not on earth, but in the next life, in the next world, there's not gender or sex. It says we'll be like the angels and neither male nor female. So I'm not sure I fully understand the person's question here, but I'll just see what you do with that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll note real quick, the in eternity they'll be like the angels in heaven. I don't think that passage specifically mentions male and female. It just says they'll neither marry nor be given in marriage. The neither male nor female language we get from Galatians 3 verse 28, I believe. And there's some discussion as to whether nor is there male and female actually means like,
It's
you know,
symbolic.
the differences between maleness and female are
between
erased. So interesting questions, I think, to be asked about how our maleness or femaleness persists into eternity. It seems like, but leaving that aside for the time being, to get to what I'm understanding of this question, I do think there's a valuable distinction to be made between the part of maleness and femaleness that has to do with just our sexed body, how we present externally, and the part of maleness or femaleness that has to do with like internality and again, big massive conversation about even the difference between gender and sex to be had there. What I feel like I read with great confidence when I read Genesis chapter 1 is this, that there was in the ancient world, I'm thinking, for instance, of ancient Greek philosophers who were very down on women and the female body specifically. Like they saw the female body as a deformity of the male body. Like if you were born inside out, then you turned out to be a woman, and like a right side out person, a properly developed person, was a male. And so in contradistinction to that kind of narrative that suggests, oh, there's a right and better way of being human, both in body and in soul, and there's a lesser way, it seems to me what Genesis 1 is trying to do most of all is say, no, like the different forms of human embodiment, and however those things connect to the different forms of human ensoulment, if we see those things as connected, those differences are purposefully given, to borrow the language of the previous commenter. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. So if somebody wants to buy your books, obviously they're available wherever books are sold. Single Gay Christian is one of them, No Longer Strangers, and The Limits of My World. The other one that was just published, what's the title again of that?
Oh, Sexuality Beyond Sex. It comes out in November, but it is now available for pre-order. So if you look up that one and you want to grab a copy, you can at least get your name on the list now.
And are there other places, are there ways that people can engage with you? Online,
sure.
Website, Twitter X, maybe not so much because you don't read it.
Yeah, Twitter, I'm not there. But you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And then you can also, I do have a website, gregorycoles.com. But these days, if you're like me, you'll just throw the name into Google and see what happens. So yeah, have fun. But I am around, so I would be glad to connect with you further.
I've just put those in the chat, which will go out on all channels. And what was the name of the website again?
GregoryColes.com.
One word.
Yeah.
There we go. We'll show that up on the screen as well. So thank you so much. Final words to the audience.
I would say this, that I am so deeply convinced that Jesus is kind and Jesus is worth trusting. And so, though I, like a wise younger Wade, will not presume to name for you precisely everything that Jesus might invite you into, I'm deeply convinced that what he does invite you into, if it is actually Jesus, it'll be kind and it'll be worth trusting.
Thank you. Well spoken. And my simple tagline is you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. Greg, I'd love to have you back, perhaps after that, after you find a new editor or later on in your journey. It's been truly a pleasure and educational. I did learn some things that were important. As always, I will be reviewing the transcript and writing an article about what I learned, publishing it on my Substack and sending that out. So you can check that out. And the audience is weighing in and just saying thank you as well for this fascinating conversation. Do stay tuned if you're in the audience for one last thing, and that is the sneak peek of what's coming up next week on Created in the Image of God. Greg, if you want to hang out for a couple of minutes, we can chat. If you got to run, I understand. I'll still be here after the sneak peek, but for the audience, we will see you next week. Here's what's coming up.
Amazing. Thanks.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, May 24th at 7 a.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Chinyere Egbe, economist and professor at Medgar Evers College. He explores the intersection of finance, education, and economic development, and how data-driven thinking can expand access and opportunity, from building programs in financial economics to advancing opportunity and empowerment in Central Brooklyn and beyond. And then on Tuesday, May 26th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews R.J. Snell, Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute and Editor-in-Chief of Public Discourse. He reflects on questions of truth, ethics, and the human person, and how we make sense of meaning in a fragmented age, from moral responsibility in education to the deeper pursuit of clarity, purpose, and the good life. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the Image of God.